Welcome. I'm Jim English. I'm the director of the Penn Humanities Forum. I want in particular to welcome the prospective doctoral students in English to the forum, and to let you know that if you do, as I hope, end up doing your PhD work here at Penn, that the Humanities Forum's doors are open, and we have many opportunities for graduate students. I've spoken to a few of you about that and would be glad to talk to others after this session is over. I'm going to do very brief two-sentence introductions to our participants today, because it's really a great opportunity for us to hear from these three people in the same room at the same time about new ways of reading. They've all made major contributions in recent years to our conversations about modes and methods of literary study. So I want to cut to the chase. Stephen took his doctorate from the English department. Stephen Best took his doctorate from the English department here at Penn, and he won our Diane Hunter Best Dissertation Prize. That was back in 1997. He's since then been on the faculty of the English department at UC Berkeley, with occasional stints and fellowships elsewhere. He's been a leading voice in the field of law and literature, also in the field of African American studies. His book, The Fugitive's Properties, Law and the Poetics of Possession, published by Chicago in 2004, is a landmark work in both of those fields. And it's a subtle account of the way race has informed American thought about property, agency, and personhood. Sharon Marcus also did her PhD here at Penn. Sharon, now that's a lie. But Sharon has laryngitis and is unable to speak, so she can't actually prevent me from telling these lies that reflect well on us. No, Sharon did her work at Hopkins, and she taught at Berkeley and overlapped with Stephen for some years, and then departed for Columbia, where she's currently the Orlando Harriman Professor of English and Comparative Literature. She's a specialist in 19th century lit and in queer studies, author of two very important books, Apartment Stories, City and Home in 19th Century Paris and London, and Between Women, Friendship, Desire, and Marriage in Victorian England. That second book won 5 Best Book Awards, count them, including the Perkins Prize for the best work in narrative studies and the Lambda Literary Award for the best book in LGBT studies. More recently, Sharon founded the online journal Public Books, which has become, for me, and I hope for many of you, a go-to venue for writing about literature and literary culture that's intellectually rigorous, but also fun and exciting and lively to read. Heather Love is our own Arine Brownlee Professor of English. She's been at Penn for a decade after being a postdoctoral fellow at Harvard. Her book, Feeling Backward, Loss in the Politics of Queer History, is really a seminal book in queer studies. It's been one of the most influential works in the emergence of a new affect studies, and in sort of changing our understandings of the cultural role played by bad feelings. Now, Sharon and Stephen, as many of you will know, teamed up on a widely read and discussed special issue of an academic journal, Representations, in the fall of 2009. That was called The Way We Read Now. Their introduction to that issue, surface reading, provided one of the points of departure for an essay that came out the next year that Heather wrote called Close But Not Deep, Literary Ethics and the Descriptive Turn. That was published in New Literary History. The force of these interventions has helped to put terms like close and distant, surface and depth at the center of our methodological debates for the past several years. So we now have the chance to hear a sort of update on some of those debates, to learn how they see these debates as taking us toward maybe yet newer ways of reading. Sharon, as I said, is not able to speak aloud, so we've got various workarounds, one of which is that Heather will be reading Sharon's paper, and the other of which is during the Q&A, when we'll bring the table over a bit. Sharon will be typing responses, and you will see the writing on the screen. So just to prepare you for these workarounds, and despite that slight wrinkle, I think this is just going to be a very exciting event. And please join me in welcoming our three participants.
Okay, thanks very much, Jim, and to the Humanities Forum, to Sarah Varney, and welcome to the Perspectives, and everybody else as well. So I'm going to be Heather, and then I'm going to be Sharon, and then I'm going to be Heather again, and then Stephen can be himself. So I just wanted to, Jim very helpfully put this event in some context, talking about the special issue that Sharon and Stephen edited, and then a piece where I was kind of responding to them and really into their project and trying to kind of extend it. One other context is just that we are now actually trying to collaborate, the three of us, on a book project together, which really extends this notion of surface reading and tries to put it into practice and show how it might be useful. So we're kind of working on that now. But I think another context is just a kind of broad interest in reading across disciplines, actually, today. People thinking about what is reading, how has it varied across time, what does the emergence of new technologies do to our experience of reading, what's actually going on in our brains when we're reading. Is that experience of reading stable across languages, across cultures, across literary and non-literary texts? What's the difference between everyday practices of reading and the kind of professional reading that we do? So surface reading, Sharon and Stephen's essay tried to survey a lot of new methods that seemed to take an interest in kind of new modes of reading that were emerging in literary studies. They also proposed their own new method, surface reading, articulated in opposition to some modes of reading that are very familiar in professional literary studies. Depth hermeneutics, that's to say looking past the surface of a text for what it really means, and critical hermeneutics, or what sometimes gets called symptomatic or suspicious reading, looking for beyond a text surface to see what it really means, often finding that the text is a mask for the operations of power. We basically are trying to do something else, to suspend the operations of deep interpretation and to see what else it's possible to see and do, practicing other modes of analysis, description, rearrangement, juxtaposition, paraphrase, and so on, some of what we'll be talking about today. Responses to this essay, surface reading, were pretty mixed, kind of a test case of whether any publicity is good publicity. There were a lot of critiques. I'll just go through a few of them. A critique that Stephen and Sharon were embracing the surface, but really one couldn't embrace the surface without embracing depth. We should actually be challenging the distinction itself. They called it naive. Actually, surface reading is impossible. We're always interpreting. They called it apolitical, that really critical hermeneutics is the only responsible method, given that literary texts, like the rest of the cultural tradition, are, in Walter Benjamin's words, documents of barbarism, and also a critique that they were labeling something as new, which actually people had been doing all along. And that the kind of what they were characterizing as depth reading actually involved readings of the surface. So just to give you a sense of what the broader conversation is, to frame the talks, we're going to be addressing some of those critiques today, but also trying to build on the concept of surface reading. And I think we are interested in saying this isn't absolutely new. And actually, if you think about the title, New Ways of Reading, Histories of Surface Reading, we're really trying to think about how surface reading has already been happening. And actually, Sharon and I will be kind of focusing on some intellectual precursors for what we call surface reading, and also focusing on the question of description as method. And Stephen is going to offer a meditation on what constitutes a literary surface by looking at a couple of cases from the visual arts. So that's the kind of overview, just to give you a sense of what we're up to. Now I'm Sharon. Okay, so this is Sharon. Now I'm Sharon. In surface reading, Stephen Best and I made the case for an interpretive mode that focuses on what texts say rather than on what they do not say. We use the metaphor of the surface to contrast this kind of reading with forms of symptomatic reading that focus on what texts do not say, or that articulate aspects of the text figured as deep and hidden. Positive and negative responses linked surface reading to practices of description. This paper addresses two questions about description. 1, is description possible? 2, is description compatible with critique? By critique, I mean very broadly, judging what one reads in order either to condemn or approve it. Description is commonly held to be impossible because preconceptions prevent us from seeing objects clearly. Description is also usually opposed to critique because description claims neutrality, and critique avows an interested, committed point of view. On the common account, then, description can neither be critical nor descriptive. In the first part of this paper, I suggest that critique cannot do without description, using Ellen Rooney's polemical response to surface reading as an example. In the second part, I look at the centrality of description and its compatibility with critique in two works by Roland Bart, SZ, and Mythologies. In Live Free or Describe, The Reading Effect and the Persistence of Form, published in Differences in 2010, Ellen Rooney argues for a type of symptomatic reading very different from the depth model, one that, quote, disrupts the distinction between description and analysis, reading and writing, inside and outside, surface and depth. In the process, she also argues strenuously against surface reading for seeking to, quote, practice accurate critical description, stating, quote, that description as a mode of reading doesn't work at all because description is, in her words, always already a matter of interpretation. What reasons does Rooney give for claiming that description doesn't work at all? First, she associates description with ideologically motivated notions of meaning as obvious and therefore instantly apprehensible. Second, she associates surface reading with two implicitly denigrated critical methods, paraphrase and tautology. Rooney rejects paraphrase as by definition impossible, calling it, quote, a reading practice that disavows reading's own formal activities. Tautology appears more obliquely, and is not named as such, when Rooney writes, quote, description can never be literal and thereby undistorted, and elaborates in an endnote, quote, the only truly adequate description would be one that repeated the text verbatim from beginning to end. Rooney's third way of showing that description doesn't work at all is to demonstrate that, quote, an instance of description offered in surface reading of Althusser's version of symptomatic reading, does not describe his intervention in either a complete or undistorted way, omits his pivotal terms, and, quote, discounts his manifest rejection of a depth model of knowledge. Rooney does not present her account of Althusser as a better description than ours. Doing so would concede that description is possible, since it would rely on the premise that some descriptions are better than others. Instead, Rooney frames her critique as a matter of holding us to our own standards. She writes, quote, it seems fair to ask that an argument seeking to persuade us to take description as the test of reading itself offer exemplary descriptions of other texts. At a minimum, it ought to demonstrate in its own practice that such a description is possible. For now, I'll set aside the question of whether our introduction set itself the task of modeling surface reading and whether our description of Althusser was accurate. Indeed, let's assume Rooney was right and we got Althusser wrong, because what interests me is how Rooney's argument hinges on demonstrating that. Rooney attributes to us alone the belief that critics should strive for accuracy in description, with what texts say serving as the standard for adjudicating accuracy. I think she is incorrect to say she does not agree with us on these points. How does Rooney prove her claim that description must always fail? By showing that one of our descriptions fails. This is a hasty generalization. Showing that one description fails does not prove that all descriptions must fail. It isn't logically significant, only situationally ironic, even embarrassing, that those making the failed description believe in the possibility of accurate description. More significantly, Rooney's refutation of description in general, by pointing to the errors of one description in particular, involves her in a contradiction. She can only identify our description as failed by replacing our account of Althusser with a more correct one that better describes Althusser's ideas. Although Rooney rejects paraphrase at the outset of the essay, her better account of Althusser is nothing if not a description, complete with bullet points, paraphrase, and citations, that take Althusser at his word. To demonstrate that we omitted important aspects of Althusser's account and misconstrued others, Rooney must offer the more complete and correct description that she deems impossible. This is, of course, my way of putting it. Rooney is aware of the problem she faces in pointing out our mistakes, and is rigorous about never calling our reading of Althusser wrong, or her accounts of his work, or of ours, a description. Instead, Rooney writes that she is only holding us accountable to our own standards. Attributing the standard of accuracy exclusively to us allows Rooney to discredit our description as incomplete and inaccurate, while claiming to have no interest herself in completeness or accuracy. Rooney acknowledges that she risks engaging in a contradictory enterprise. Quote, "The moment has come to describe surface reading," she writes, "in the full knowledge that there is nothing at all simple about that task. Indeed, from my point of view, it is literally impossible." Yet she describes surface reading anyway and replaces its faulty descriptions with better ones because, and this is my point of view, description is inevitable. With description comes a striving for accuracy, and it is the text described that provides the standard for determining accuracy. If accuracy were truly impossible, we could not determine the inaccuracy or insufficiency of any given description, and determining the inaccuracy of specific descriptions seems necessary for proving the insufficiency of description in general. To prove description's impossibility, Rooney must rely on its possibility. What about Rooney's other two objections to surface reading? Its reliance on obviousness and on inoperable methods of extreme paraphrase. I can now see that surface was in many ways a poorly chosen metaphor, given its implications of superficiality and hence of speedy apprehension. But it is those conventionally pejorative notions of the surface that I would like to trouble. It was never our aim, Stephen and Sharon's, to argue that it is easy to read what lies on a text surface. If anything, we were pointing to how much simpler it is to find hidden deep meanings that are already familiar and may be true than to focus on textual elements for which we have no ready explanatory framework. Surface reading is about excruciatingly sustained close reading, about the need to linger on the surface and describe its complexity. However, where close reading usually implies a focus on a small unit of text, often an extract, I take surface reading to include close reading of large units of text in their entirety, and of interwoven texts, for example, a 19th century novel and the articles in the journal where that novel was first serialized, assembled into a complex fabric. To think about surface reading as close reading, I want to linger a bit on one of a now classic work. Work of literary criticism that still has the experimental, innovative charge it possessed when it was first published in 1970, Roland Barthes' Essed. Essed consists of 93 short essays on such topics as interpretation, the prattle of meaning, the reassembled body, and aesthetic proof, topics that Bart broaches through a reading of an 1830 novella by Balzac, Sarrasine. Bart's essays are simultaneously readings of Balzac's text and reflections on the process of reading itself. Just as Bart breaks his own ideas down into 93 short essays, he breaks the entirety of Balzac's novella into 561 lexia, brief, continuous fragments that are units of reading. Essed thus constitutes a step-by-step reading of Balzac's novella, a reading that depends on decomposing the text into lexia and then amplifying each lexia with commentary. In an appendix, Bart also reproduces Balzac's novella without any other commentary than the addition of lexia numbers. Essed is perhaps the most excruciatingly close reading in the history of literary criticism, one that does what Rooney suggests truly adequate description must do, repeat a text verbatim from beginning to end, not once, but twice. If by description we mean an account that strives to be as complete as possible, then Essed is hyper-descriptive, description on steroids. Yet it would be tendentious to call Essed a surface reading, because Bart manifestly opposes appeals to literalism and sees critics and readers as actively producing texts, not standing back to describe them. On the other hand, Bart offers an interesting precursor to surface reading because he wants to avoid penetrating or reversing the text, and because he is interested in analyzing the text in its entirety. Ultimately, Bart is neither a surface reader nor a depth one. While he breaks the text into codes, which seems to imply a depth model, he's more interested in how the codes create a network of voices than in presenting them as keys to the text's single, true meaning. The story Bart selects for analysis, Sarracine, is itself a commentary on how to interpret surfaces and depths. In it, a man tells a woman a story about another man, Sarracine, who fell in love with a singer, La Zambinella, whom he believes is a woman but learns is a castrato. One can read the story as a cautionary fable about the dangers of surface reading, whose credulous hero illustrates the folly of taking appearances literally and of mistaking interpretations for facts. One can also read Sarracine as a critique of suspicious reading, of Sarracine's assumption that gendered appearances express unseen sexual truths. Not content to remain on the level of Zambinella's surface, ignoring Zambinella's manifest warnings, "I forbid you to love me," Sarracine consistently leaps to deep conclusions about what Zambinella's surfaces mean. Essed critiques both symptomatic and surface reading. Bart states throughout that he is not trying to establish the text's truth or deep structure, its totalizing, unified, denotative meaning. Instead, he seeks to multiply the text signifiers and their connotations. For Bart, to interpret a text is to appreciate its particular plurality. He refuses to identify the text with either surface or depth. Quote, "The text in its mass is comparable to a sky, simultaneously flat and deep, smooth, without edges or landmarks." He therefore does not identify criticism with piercing or unmasking the text or its readers, but with amplifying, rearranging, and disassembling it. To read a text is to break it into pieces, briser, to unfold it like a fan, and to star it, a poor translation of étoilé, which has many meanings, to cluster, to shatter into a star-like pattern, and to decorate with a scattering of stars. How does description work in Essed? Confining itself to textual evidence, Essed is a meditation on how the evident fails to be obvious. Bart suggests that replication of a text in its entirety can be a viable critical method. But Essed is not exactly a replication, since Bart amplifies the text with commentary. Rather than see this as a failure of description, I'd like to think about this as a definition of description, and ask whether description is compatible with commentary and explanation. Indeed, what makes Essed a description is not the fact that Bart reproduces Balzac's story, but that he amplifies it by braiding and unfolding its codes, analyzes it by peeling apart its fused layers, and breaks down his own reading process so that his description of the text incorporates a description of the act of reading it. Bart claims neither perfect correctness nor perfect completeness for his description of Sarracine. But the fact that Essed does not describe everything about Sarracine does not annul the interest or accuracy of what it does describe. Indeed, by providing Balzac's text, Bart invites correction and further extension of his description, with the text as the reference point for adjudicating disagreements and the chief resource for amplifying his already amped-up readings. The relationship of description to explanation leads to my final point about description's compatibility with critique. When we object to description by saying it is always actually prescriptive, we fault it on two grounds. First, general duplicity. Description claims to be something it is not. Second, a specific imposture. Description claims to be neutral and objective, and it is not. This assumes that descriptions must be perfectly accurate, not striving for degrees of accuracy, that they must be completely free of any distortion, rather than attempting to correct for inevitable distortion, and that descriptions should be dispassionate, free of affect, detached, and distant from what they describe, even as we assume that they never can be. The example of Essed suggests otherwise. Its descriptions are sometimes distanced, but always immersive, an example of the kind of reading Heather Love has called close but not deep. I'd like to conclude with the question of critique by turning to the zero degree of description we call tautology. I would not equate description and tautology because, as I've been suggesting, I think that description can amplify or compress, analyze, and even explain what it describes, while a tautology repeats it exactly. But if a description claims to be an account of an object, and the object in its entirety provides the standard for testing the description, then we can never fully untangle description and tautology. Tautology is on the horizon for any description. And if tautology can become a vehicle of critique, then surely description can as well. To explore this question, I want to turn to a tautologically titled essay in Roland Barthes' Mythologies entitled Racine is Racine, which criticizes tautology for blocking critique. Do you guys have the handout? Yes. Okay. If you can share with your neighbors also if you don't have it. So Racine is Racine, the tautologically titled Racine is Racine, which criticizes tautology for blocking critique, though I hope Bart wouldn't mind that I've tautologically reproduced his essay in its entirety on the handout. There's a few more coming around, so maybe raise your hand if you still need one. For Bart, tautology explains nothing, but it does plenty. Tautology is a petty bourgeois predilection. It is aggressive, putting thought on a tight leash. It is anti-intellectual, imposing a furious rupture between intelligence and its object. Tautologies are duplicitous, claiming innocently to be retrieving the true Racine, when in fact, for those uttering the tautologies, Racine is always something other than Racine. Quote. Interestingly, this suggests that tautology is guilty of failing to sustain itself as tautology, which lessens the charge against tautology as tautology. Bart also objects that those who brandish tautology avoid, quote, the risks that even the slightest positive search for the truth inevitably, fatalement, involves, promoting laziness to the rank of rigor. The essay ends, Racine is Racine, the admirable confidence of nothingness, replacing the tautological citation, Racine is Racine, with an anti-tautological definition of tautology as an emptiness full of itself. This argument against tautology resonates, or full of itself. Okay. This argument against tautology resonates with much of Barthes' work. Quote, Racine alone, Racine degree zero, this doesn't exist, he states, just as there is no writing degree zero and no nature uninflected by history and culture. But this essay against tautology adopts tautology as a structuring principle. It begins and ends with the same phrase, Racine is Racine, and presents three tautologies, title, epigraph, and example, before we've hit the second sentence. The statement that prompts the essay, Athalie is a play by Racine, is technically not a tautology, but has a tautology's disingenuous obviousness. This alerts us to the tautological mood of Barthes' own writing in the third paragraph, three of whose four sentences appeal to what one already knows about tautology. On reconnaît, on connaît, on sait. For another instance of Bart fighting tautology with tautology, take the second part of the sentence in the third paragraph that begins, On connaît la scie, we know the routine. Or as Richard Howard puts it in his new translation, we know the old saws. Here, Bart ventriloquizes the tautologue, quote, too much intelligence is harmful, philosophy is useless jargon, art dies from too much intellectuality. These statements are not themselves tautologies. They are the reasons people give for believing in tautology. But gathering them under the rubric of la scie, Bart makes clear that he does not agree with these views. Rhetorically, however, these are echoes, and echoes are tautological. One might conclude from Racine is Racine, not that tautology is inevitable, but that it is contagious, so totalizing, so repetitive, so engulfing, that even criticisms of it assume the form of the already said and the already known. What especially interests me is how Bart uses tautology differently from how he describes others using it. His tautological statements about tautology combine description with explanation and disagreement. Where ordinarily tautology affirms what it repeats, Bart repeats tautologies in order to mock them. Bart's title, Racine et Racine, is a tautology, but it is also a citation. Citation is itself tautological. It simply repeats what was said. But as the epigraph from Bouvard and Pécuchet reminds us, it is the simple repetition of a statement can serve to deflate it as well as to affirm it. Racine is Racine gives us two types of tautology, one repeating to affirm, one repeating to critique. In most of the essays in Mythologies, description is sarcastic, but occasionally, as in the first essay on amateur wrestling, description is appreciative. This suggests that, even as literal repetition, description entails no single political stance. Descriptions can approve and disapprove, reinforce, and reject. Many would take Bart's fusion of description and evaluation as yet another instance of description failing to be neutral and thus failing to be truly descriptive. I think it shows that description neither requires neutrality nor imposes acquiescence. The presence of evaluation and explanation in a description do not compromise it as a description, because describing an object does not require us to have no views about it. Indeed, description consists of nothing but views of an object, but it requires that we test those views by looking at the object repeatedly from different vantage points to see if our ways of looking at it have distorted it. Description can be a vehicle of critique because one can agree or disagree with what one describes. Description entails neither instant acquiescence nor automatic indictment of what one describes. At the same time, critique requires description because one can't know if one agrees or disagrees with what a text says without describing it. A judgment of a specific object is only worthwhile as a judgment of that object if someone who disagrees with the judgment would have to agree with the description of the object. We can decide as critics to argue about values, not objects, but then our arguments might be clearer if we dispense with the objects altogether. If our disagreement about how to describe a poem is really a disagreement about values external to the poem, why waste time arguing about the poem? Critique can motivate description. Bart wants to explain how bourgeois culture and realism work because he objects to them, and so he describes their products with the utmost care and from multiple vantage points. He looks at them, he looks through them, he sinks into them. He merges with them and pushes them away. The title of Mythologies performs this fusion of description and critique. It is a colloquial synonym for myth that Bart also uses to signify the analysis and critique of myth, just as he uses mythologist, which normally means a teller of myths, to mean a demystifier of myths. The mythologist's tasks, he tells us, is to déchiffrer myths. In French, déchiffrer means both to decode and, in musical terminology, to sight read. The decoder uncovers a hidden meaning, but the sight reader simply replicates a tune, translating musical notation into embodied, audible melody. Bart faults tautologists for avoiding, quote, even the slightest positive search for the truth. But to tell the truth about how tautology evades truth, Bart must describe it. The search for truth, in even the smallest degree, cannot avoid description, even if we confine ourselves to describing the interests and imperfections of efforts to describe. But if we can describe the interests and imperfection of efforts to describe, then description is possible. And if description is possible, why not try to describe texts as well as argue over values? Okay, this is now me. And then I will stop talking, and other people can talk. But I'm going to talk a little bit more before that happens. In his 1973 essay, Thick Description Toward an Interpretive Theory of Culture, Clifford Geertz compares the practice of ethnography to, quote, trying to read, in the sense of construct a reading of, a manuscript, foreign, faded, full of ellipses, incoherencies, suspicious emendations, and tendentious commentaries, but written not in the conventionalized graphs of sound, but in transient examples of shaped behavior. Although ethnography focuses on behavior, not language, Geertz suggests that anthropologists use methods developed in literary studies to decode culture, understood as a dense, opaque, and unreliable text. In his essay, Deep Play, Notes on a Balinese Cockfight, sort of the main example we have of Geertz practicing thick description, Geertz describes culture as an ensemble of texts, quote, an ensemble of texts, which the anthropologist strains to read over the shoulders of those to whom they properly belong. It is not surprising that Geertz's account of thick description was taken up enthusiastically by literary critics. the model of reading culture that he employs was borrowed directly from practices of close reading developed in literary studies. In The Touch of the Real, 1997, Stephen Greenblatt, literary critic, looked back on this moment, quote, "Geertz's account of the project of social science rebounded with force upon literary critics like me in the 1970s. That project, according to Greenblatt, made sense of what I was already doing. The positive feedback loop that Greenblatt describes was remarkably productive throughout the 70s and 80s. In the context of a broad shift towards semiotics, self-reflexivity, subjectivity, narrative, and aesthetics across disciplines, what we now call the linguistic turn. That movement has now arguably run its course, both in the sense of having transformed the disciplines for good and in the sense of appearing, in Bruno Latour's words, to have run out of steam. The field of literary studies is no longer dominated only by interpretive or textual approaches. While literary studies has always to some extent been interdisciplinary, engaging with history and sociology, most notably, critics are now turning to more distant fields such as the natural sciences, economics, quantitative and digital methods, and cognitive psychology. The digital turn has rapidly transformed what literary scholarship looks like, and some new modes of reading seem polemically set against the disciplinary core of the field, like, for instance, Franco Moretti's distant reading, and arguably surface reading. Despite the fact that critics are increasingly drawing on materialist, quantitative, and realist methods, the field of literary studies still doesn't own a relationship to the empirical. I would want to suggest, maintaining our distance from empirical methods is key to maintaining our disciplinary identity. But in this paper, what I want to suggest is how we might begin to imagine reading as a practice that does not exclude the empirical by looking at a couple of examples of what I want to call reading in the history of the social sciences. So in formulating his version of interpretive anthropology, Geertz drew on a distinction between thin and thick description, originally made by ordinary language philosopher Gilbert Ryle in the late 60s. For Ryle, thin description was an unadorned first-order account of behavior, one that could be recorded just as well by a camera as by a human. Thick description, by contrast, added many layers of human significance, such as intention, emotion, and cognition, depth, cultural context, and display, all those affective and aesthetic qualities that literary critics look for in texts. Thick description has become foundational in literary and cultural studies, but along the way I think critics have tended to forget that thick description was, for both Geertz and for Ryle, inseparable from thin description. And instead, a purely textual, purely interpretive mode of thick description has become the norm in literary and cultural studies. Thick description is a method for analyzing behavior that employs techniques originally developed for analyzing literature. What I'm interested in and looking at today is exploring techniques for reading texts that were originally developed to analyze behavior. Looking at forms of analysis that describe patterns of behavior and visible activity, but that do not traffic in speculation about interiority, intention, meaning, or depth. Through exhaustive, fine-grained attention to phenomena, I want to suggest that thin description, or an enhanced account of thick description that includes thin description, could serve as a model for reading after the decline of the linguistic turn. So, Geertz turns to a moment in Ryle's essay, The Thinking of Thoughts, which is about winking. According to Ryle, a thick description of a wink might see it as a form of communication, collusion, mimicry, or some other kind of meaningful interaction. A thin description would merely account for the physical act of the contraction of the eyelid. So this is Ryle, the sort of famous passage on the wink. Two boys fairly swiftly contract the eyelids of their right eyes. In the first boy, this is only an involuntary twitch, but the other is winking conspiratorially to an accomplice. At the lowest or the thinnest level of description, the two contractions of the eyelid may be exactly alike. From a cinematograph film of the two faces, there might be no telling which contraction, if either, was a wink, or which, if either, was a twitch. Yet there remains the immense but unphotographable difference between a twitch and a wink. For to wink is to try to signal to someone in particular, without the cognizance of others, a definite message according to an already understood code. A mere twitch has no intended recipient. It is not meant to be unwitnessed by anybody. It carries no message. It may be a symptom, but it is not a signal. Ryle's example of the two boys emphasizes the unphotographable difference between a twitch and a wink, that's the thick description, as well as the photographable lack of difference between the two, that's the thin description. Thin description means taking up the position of the device. By turning oneself into a camera, one could, at least ideally, pay equal attention to every aspect of a scene that is available to the senses. Ryle's emphasis on the technicity of the observer is marked, and it links his account to practices of observation and description that were quite common in post-war social science. In her article, Film Projectors as Microscopes, Martha Davis identifies this period as what she calls the golden age of naturalistic observation of films and tapes. Davis describes the way that new technologies, like slow-motion playback devices and ways of improving sound and visual film synchronization, transformed analytic methods in the 50s and 60s. While he takes great pains to elaborate the complexity of this performance of winking, Ryle writes that, quote, "There is still only one thing that the boy is trying to do. There is still only one contraction of the eyelids that at a given moment the cinematograph film records." He goes on, quote, "The thinnest description of what the rehearsing parodist is doing is roughly the same as for the involuntary eyelid twitch, but its thick description is a many-layered sandwich, of which only the bottom slice is catered for by that thinnest description." For Ryle, an account of a wink is incomplete without the layers of meaning that separate it from a twitch. But an account of a wink that does not include the twitch is also incomplete. What the camera captures cannot be expunged from the scene without destroying it. This slice of behavior is bound up with all the other elements of interaction. So Geertz, like Ryle, is interested in these unphotographable aspects that separate the wink from the twitch, but he does not stint attention to its photographable elements as a result. Geertz attends to the layers of intention and meaning that turn mere behavior into culture. He argues that ethnography tends to appear to be more observational than it really is. It's taken to be a matter of mere recording. Geertz writes that, in fact, quote, "What we call our data are really our own constructions of other people's constructions of what they and their compatriots are up to." Critiquing the concept of objectivity and pointing to the cultural work that goes into even the slightest gesture, Geertz argues that the simplest recording of behavior depends on interpretive protocols and the subjective analyses of the observer. Geertz writes, "Right down to the factual base, the hard rock, insofar as there is any, of the whole enterprise, we are already explicating, and worse, explicating explications, winks upon winks upon winks." Geertz's insistence on winks rather than blinks is key to explaining the influence of thick description in the humanities. Geertz reasserts this point later, citing an Indian story about an Englishman who, having been told that the world rested on a platform, which rested on the back of an elephant, which rested in turn on the back of a turtle, asked, "What did the turtle rest on?" The answer, another turtle, affords Geertz a memorable account of the condition of things. Quote, "It is turtles all the way down." This legend drives home Geertz's critique of an unquestioning empiricism, but it doesn't do justice to his account of thick description or to the debt that he owes to Ryle. Formulas such as winks upon winks upon winks and "it is turtles all the way down" suggest that there is no bottom slice. Geertz's attack was aimed at the tradition that understood the bottom slice as the factual basis of reality, but rather than throw out that slice, Geertz saw it, as Ryle did, as an account that could be analytically, if not practically, separated out for observation and study. Thick description is a polemic against prevailing norms in the social sciences. Geertz made his argument in the context of a discussion of ethnography as an observational practice. In this context, Geertz did not have to make an argument for the significance of thin description. He assumed it. That's what ethnographers do. It was thick description, or the work of interpretation, that he had to make the argument for. Paul Ricoeur emphasizes this feature of Geertz's work in his essay Representations Are Social Facts. He writes that the core activity for Geertz, quote, "is still social description of the other, however modified by new conceptions of discourse, author, or text." In literary and cultural studies, where fieldwork is rare, thick description is taken up as a wholesale critique of empiricism, whereas Geertz Geertz's aim, I want to argue, was to build a better empiricism. Despite his extensive borrowing from literary studies, Geertz suggests that pure textual reading, outside of the context of ethnographic practices of observation, recording, and description, is full of pitfalls. Quote, "The danger that cultural analysis, in search of all too deep-lying turtles, will lose touch with the hard surface. The danger is that cultural analysis, in search of all too deep-lying turtles, will lose touch with the hard surfaces of life, with the political, economic, stratificatory realities within which men are everywhere contained, and with the biological and physical necessities on which those surfaces rest. The only defense against it, this danger, and against thus turning cultural analysis into a kind of cultural aestheticism, is to train such analysis on such realities in the first place." Geertz undermines the bedrock assumptions of traditional empiricism, but warns that endlessly elaborated accounts of deep-lying turtles risk ignoring the biological and physical necessities on which culture depends. He does not then deprecate the bottom layer of the sandwich, and in fact he criticizes Ryle for having a fake bottom layer. Ryle's description of cultural activity, Geertz writes, is a bit artificial, since it is elaborated via one of the what he calls the little stories that Oxford philosophers like to make up for themselves. So these comments suggest that Geertz's essay, despite its influence in literary and cultural studies, is a somewhat awkward fit with that field, given the fact that the field is not grounded in the observation of human behavior, but in the reading of texts. There is a chance that we can, at least in Geertz's view, get lost looking for all too deep-lying turtles and lose touch with the hard surfaces of life. Okay, so what I want to do now is turn toward an example of reading that is not textual from the observational social sciences to suggest how empirical forms of description might serve as a model for literary critics. So I'm looking at an exemplary practice of collaborative reading in the post-war period, and this is this project called The Natural History of an Interview, which was begun at the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences in Palo Alto in 1955-56. The psychoanalyst Frieda Fromm-Reichmann initiated the project. At the time, she was losing her hearing and wanted to conduct a scientific study of the visual mechanisms of empathy. So in a series of meetings from 1955 through 1961, this group of linguists, anthropologists, sociologists, animal behaviorists, and others collaborated to exhaustively describe and code some brief sequences of filmed behavior provided by Gregory Bateson and taken from his psychotherapy research. So it was basically about 10 to 15 minutes of filmed behavior of a woman interacting with her husband and son in her kitchen. And the transcription, microanalysis, and interpretation of this 10 minutes of behavior on film, captured on film, took place over about 150 hours of meetings. The result, compiled by a team of researchers that included Bateson as well as Ray Birdwhistle, the linguist Norman McQuown, Charles Hockett, and the psychiatrist Henry Brosen, was a 700-page document that sought to fully describe the linguistic, nonverbal, and interactional components of this strip of activity. And that you can find that on microfilm in the University of Chicago Library. It wasn't actually published for maybe reasons that might be obvious, but so in the 50s through the 1970s, forms of microanalysis aided by new recording technologies were practiced across many disciplines: sociology, anthropology, psychology, linguistics, animal behavior studies, kinesics, interaction studies, communications, and ecology. And just to characterize this research for a minute, it was characterized by an interest in social interaction at a small scale, an emphasis on observable behavior, systems thinking, ecology, and attention to dynamic context, morphology, that's to say painstaking attention to the micro level of behavior and appearance, comparison, and theorizing based on empirical observation, a natural history approach of observation of behavior in the field, and a reluctance to speculate about the interior life of one's research subjects. Randall Collins, here at Penn, describes the work of these micro-researchers in the period as radically empirical work on everyday situations. Like other projects of total description in the period, the Natural History of an Interview did not aspire to objectivity. Although the project was empirical, it was not positivist. Albert Schefflin, commenting on this moment, argues that it was not merely a revival of behaviorism. Writing in 1973, he notes, "Behavior has come to be observed in its own right, That is, we study its structure and do not merely make inferences about neurophysiological or cognitive process. While microsociologists and interactionists inherited an emphasis on observable action and a refusal to speculate about interiority from behaviorists, they were not interested in conditioning or universal reflexes. Bateson consistently argued against the narrow vision of the experimentalists. These researchers drew their definition of behavior more from animal ethology as it was practiced by European ethologists like Konrad Lorenz and Nicolas Tinbergen, not on mainstream American behavioral psychology. They eschewed the laboratory model, practicing immersive observational practices. And it's interesting to note, along with the editors of Conversation Analysis and Psychotherapy, that psychotherapy and psychiatric interviews provided the very first materials of the study of naturally occurring tape-recorded or filmed interaction. So these examples of naturalistic observation of behavior didn't avoid questions of psychic life, but approached these aspects of existence from the outside, through the observation and analysis of gesture, body posture, touch, facial movements, spacing, speech patterns, and so on. In the introduction to his book, Kinesics in Context, Ray Birdwhistell, the sort of father of kinesics or the study of gesture, remembers the technical and methodological triumphs of the natural history of an interview. He writes, quote, "During the course of investigation, techniques were developed that reduce recording and analysis time from about 100 hours per second to less than 1 hour per second. Because of the richness of a 10-second stretch, isolated for study but always returned to context for comparative analysis, these methods gave us data at the rate of 1 hour of investigation per second of behavior seemed efficient enough to use in larger research." A lot of people didn't agree with Birdwhistell about this, that 100 hours of analysis for 1 second of behavior wasn't really efficient enough. Okay, and mainstream sociologists today certainly would use the natural history interview as an kind of example of why microsociology didn't really have a future, right? Pointing to that it didn't have big theoretical payoffs, and also that it was painstakingly that this sort of took so much time and effort. If you think about Sharon's invocation of the excruciatingly close reading, it's really on the basis of such a damning association with the humanities, inefficient, non-systematic, that microsociology has been denounced. I think it's one of the things to say is that these researchers, because they paid so much attention to the local and the particular, produced descriptions rather than portable concepts. However, I want to suggest that the combination of painstaking description of observed behaviors with semiotic and structural analysis makes such projects an interesting model for literary critics today, as well as a rare example of collaborative reading across disciplines. So, even though the natural history of an interview is a kind of grand failure, I think for many, the project makes clear many of the things. It makes evident. It embodies many of the things that literary critics value in reading: slowness, attention to detail, comparison, contextualization, and self-reflexivity. These are not merely the domain of literary critics. I think they have been and can be practiced in other disciplinary contexts and with different kinds of objects. In the preface to his essay collection, Local Knowledge, Geertz writes, "If everything in general is out of reach and likely to stay there, not everything in particular is." Geertz's attention across his career to, quote, unshapely and incongruent, even unique particulars, finds a parallel in the work of the microanalysts who sought to do justice to the infinite particularity of human behavior and interaction. Literature might also be considered a science of the concrete, and despite intermittent attempts at systematization, literary critics tend to champion the particular instance over the general law. But I think the division between the humanities and the social sciences has made it difficult to recognize this shared commitment to particularity. Data and details, thin and thick description, come together in the microanalytic tradition. There are obvious challenges in developing a mode of reading that is based not on the analysis of texts, but on the analysis of behavior. And it was, in fact, nonverbal behavior that was often the point of these analyses. These are very different kinds of objects, human behavior and text. Thin description has links with approaches that are anathema in literary studies, another challenge, behaviorism, functionalism, and empiricism, and such practices can appear objectifying, naive, or insufficiently critical. But my argument is that by dismissing the empirical altogether, literary critics have cut themselves off from important dimensions of experience and representation. They have also refused a set of techniques and tools whose usefulness as reading practices we have barely begun to explore: morphology, ecology, observation, natural history, and description. Thanks.
For our book, Surface Reading, History Theory, Practice, we chose Melville's Benito Cereno as our object of critical scrutiny on the contention that Captain Amasa Delano's description, though consisting of details that will be subject in the end to reinterpretation, nonetheless includes every detail, thus leaving nothing either hidden, latent, or veiled for the reader to later uncover. The slaves' mutiny and their racial subordination appear to be always there, though perhaps not always known to be there. One way of describing this would be to say that everything is on the surface. But what in fact is a literary surface if nothing is either hidden or latent in the account of the events aboard the Saint-Dominique, and yet those events are precisely what in the end we feel have been revealed to us, or feel we have successfully demystified. In the introduction to The Way We Read Now, we offered many examples of surface reading, but to the extent that we offered any conceptions of what an actual surface might be, one formulation proved to be among the more paraphrasable, that it was what we had to train ourselves to look at rather than through. But in the view of critics and supporters alike, any notion of the possibility of looking through a literary surface, of seeing the literary text as a layer that conceals, reifies surface, a reification affirmed in our desire for a descriptive criticism that attended to the surface of things in place of deep reading or a plumbing of depth. In what follows, I want to make a preliminary attempt to rethink what a surface might be, which will involve a return to the two fields through which my thinking as a scholar has been forged: art history and literary criticism. These fields have had little influence on one another when it comes to the subject of surfaces, but a case could be made that the disciplines share a conception of surface as threshold or edge, the point where the work ends that in principle concludes the process of composition. This is often why we refer to a layer of varnish or lacquer as a finish, and to finished prose when we want to describe an author's most highly wrought and authoritative version of his text. In this talk, however, I look to a number of paintings in which painted and written aspects have been deliberately conflated, but where that seems an invitation to think differently about what a literary surface is, or to stop thinking about what it is and to start thinking about what it does. My interest is in the work of two contemporary artists, Glenn Ligon and Mark Bradford, where the conflation of the painted and the written often occurs by way of an intrusion of looking into the act of reading. This is really out of focus. So, can you guys sort of make out what that says? They are the ink that gives the white page a meaning. Okay, you really can't. Sorry about that. And this is a Bradford. And I'll talk about them in greater detail in the course of the talk. These works, consisting of a great deal of text, attempt to forestall any further textualization of their surfaces, in a bid, I would maintain, to bracket themselves off from the scholarly practices that we use to discipline art, either the attempt to explicate art's meaning by restating what it represents, to restore its fragments back to the context from which they were taken, or to explain a work historically through recourse to its moment of production. So if these works seek to restrict deep reading or historical reconstruction, what sort of activity can they be said to afford? I would argue, following the lead of Theodor Adorno and Hubert Damisch, that there is thought occurring in the form of the artwork and only in that form, that is, that the artwork thinks. These are paintings in which the surface doesn't merely provide a limit that occasions the translation of the work into other mediums for thought, say through description, summation, or contextualization. That is, they are not analogies for the work of the mind when someone is engaged in critical thought. Rather, each consists of a surface that points reflexively to its own internal complexity, so it can also be said to offer its own form of critical understanding, and in that sense to be thinking for itself. That is, to be forging its ethics and politics out of its own form, rather than deriving those politics in a second-hand way from a historical context the work is taken to represent. These paintings take literary and textual surfaces as topics that they too can think about. And to the question then of what is a literary surface, they provide answers that, though odd, literary critics would be wise to ponder. In the Ligon instance, it may be nothing at all, or at least not a thing as such, but a process. And in the case of Bradford, it may be something whose extension we have neither the privilege nor the capacity to see. Let me begin with a stipulation. Much of what we think about surface and depth, the very idea that the literary surface is a layer that hides, derives from the metaphor of text as palimpsest, which has both a deconstructive genealogy in Derrida's writing sur nature and a psychoanalytic one in Freud's mystic writing pad. The figure of writing as palimpsest has meant for post-structuralism that the authority of the text is provisional, the origin is a trace, and language is inaccurate yet necessary to say. And in Freud's example of a wax slab imprinting itself on the layer of paper above, it has meant, among other things, that no consciousness is possible without the unconscious reaching out to the receptive apparatus. Post-structuralists derive their metaphor of writing as palimpsest from the image of writing on parchment, or a writing material or manuscript on which the original writing has been effaced to make room for a second writing, but in which the trace of an underwriting remains, bumping into and shaping the reading of the next layer of writing. Palimpsest was a significant metaphor in the post-structuralist genealogy that shaped me, and perhaps Sharon and Heather as well. I foreground it here out of a belief that it provides the topos of surface and depth we and our critics agree is now in need of rethinking. A Ligon surface can be taken on first glance as a kind of palimpsest. The canvas is oriented like a page. It provides a blank white material ground for another order of effects, and its literary text, this one taken from Jean Genet's Prisoner of Love, is rendered in type that appears increasingly illegible as one makes one way or reads down the page. A host of indicators point to this as a page of text to be read, to the effects at the bottom of the page as a layer of ink that hides text underneath, not least the repetitive insistence that one is looking at ink, and to the erasure entailed in palimpsests as involving the excavation of a submerged layer or the exfoliation of a surface layer, to the extent that there is a faint underwriting that can be deciphered at the bottom of the page, and it's in a print that appears to be stuck beneath a surface layer of ink. With erasure the only apparent way of unlocking whatever is underneath, the act of erasure implies elimination or removal, and in the form of a kind of exfoliation, it metaphorizes what a surface is like when it hides another depth. Here we're given to understand a surface as a thing. But Ligon's text-based paintings often cite passages from works of literature in which race appears to be lodged within a conflict between looking and reading. In fact, a Ligon canvas instigates and directs an inquiry into what it is saying by leading the reader away from what can be read in its statement and toward what can only be seen on its surface. At some point in the act of reading, the reader experiences a sort of pivot, beyond which he sees erasure as less the destruction a demystifying critic or viewer would need to enact, and more something the painting willingly performs. Erasure of the letter comes about not through the hypothetical removal of layers or of obfuscations, but through the deliberate adding of paint, in a gesture of coarsening or smudging or smearing that gives paint the material dimensions necessary for its being looked at. In heightening our awareness of the matter of writing, the emblackened crusts at the bottom of the page draw out the critical crux of the work: how perception pivots on where you cut the border between looking and reading. Does looking at the letters on a page always involve the reading of them? Is there a difference between looking at a letter and perceiving it as one, or between it being an object of awareness and an object of attention? Making one's way through the crux of a Ligon canvas, the viewer begins to see ink as paint, reading as looking, language as thing, and writing as matter. Erasure now reads as smudging and smearing, and no longer the excavation that props up the metaphor of palimpsest. The surface isn't so much a thing seen, say, the cited literary page, as a thing done, the act, in this case, of obliterating legible text in a way that makes us see the blackness of paint itself, rather than the blackness of race that this writing qua writing, intrinsically different from itself, necessarily hides or obscures. And this is what follows. If race is the thing we are expected to see, but the blackness of paint is the only thing we can it any longer hold that race is something you can look at and see, or does race only ever derive its vitality from being situated squarely inside the unresolved conflict between looking and reading that these canvases stage? There's a further dimension to these paintings that underscore a sense that their letters are at some point in the perception to be looked at rather than read. The phrase that appears in Genet's Prisoner of Love reads, "They are the ink that gives the white page a meaning." The pronoun they and the word ink referring to the Black Panthers who are Genet's subject. But here's the rub. In other works in the series, the pronoun shifts, and thus the only canvas that corresponds to an actual literary text is Prisoner of Love 3, the one you're looking at right now. The series is really rather large. I'm so sorry you can't see this, but I think it's the quality of the PDF. So now the text actually reads, "We are the ink that gives the white page a meaning," and it sort of it's just repeated up to the down to the bottom of the page. So in the other paintings in the series, such as Prisoner of Love 1, when the pronoun we replaces they, the effect of reading's denial and subversion intensifies. With the shift to the first person, it starts to seem as if the letters themselves want to restrict their potentially infinite meaning and to distill their being down to its most crucial aspect, giving the white page a meaning. The flash of self-reference that makes it appear as if the letters have declared that we are the ink tropes a kind of direct address from painting to viewer, an address that commands that viewer's presentness before the painting as its addressee. Second, the words ink and page in this piece, in the interpolated sentence, having never appeared on an actual literary page, exist beyond a field of intertextual reference and thus have even more of a sense of autonomy, painterly autonomy. They are reduced to effects of paint on the canvas. They are already, in a way, mere paint, never ink, that is, already on their way from being text that one reads to crusts of paint that one merely looks at. Since Genet never authored a book that says what Ligon says it said, the conundrum of citing a work of literature that does not exist precipitates the painting's core questions. What is a literary surface in the first place? Is it reducible to the page? Does it have the page's materiality, or does it just exploit it? Is it, in fact, something that you can look at rather than through? Or alternatively, does it exist independent of the page? Could it exist in a way inside a painting as its imagined origin? Based on a literary surface that has sprung from the artist's imagination rather than the pages of a book, the Ligon canvases aren't citing anything, though they appear to be doing just that. The words and letters of Ligon's iterated sentences have all the referential force of an imaginary number, which is to say, none at all. Mark Bradford's canvases also strike this note of the surface as actively working out a crux of a thought happening in the form. Bradford creates the very thing he must then go on to destroy. He builds his canvases by taking various kinds of found paper, such as advertisements from the underground black economy, comic book pages, concert announcements, wheat paste posters, advertising copy, album covers, and the like. He soaks all this paper in water and other agents, rendering the rigid materials pliant, and finally adds further bleaching agents, caulking. He gets most of his materials actually at Home Depot and not at art supply stores. Caulking for the bathroom, etc. Plastic mesh, mason string, polyester cord, packing cord. He adds these materials to generate effects of relief within the surface itself. Once the surface sort of dries and sediments, acquiring a kind of bulk and solidity, Bradford then power sands the result to reveal the strata underneath, turning the surface architecture that extends away from you into a visual display that expands in front of you. Let me add this. There's no appreciating the artwork apart from this violence against the semiotic order. No taking in of the effects you're being asked to see that is independent of thoughts into the forms of obliteration that cause them to appear. No mere looking at the work outside the struggle to perceive how its effects have been made to come about. And I want to look at a detail. Wow, this is really out of... Can we focus it? Sorry. You can barely read the text. Where's my laser? I'm so technically challenged, sorry. Okay, and the laser isn't working. All right, so I'll use my finger. There's like a little piece in here that I want to. Well, as it's out of focus, does it really matter? No. So this is just a fragment that's sort of embedded in the structure of the piece. In Bradford's work, the core critical activity is given over to textual fragments drawn from the sort of accumulated detritus of his South Central LA neighborhood. The fragment in Bradford triggers a dialectical process. On the one hand, it introduces a logic of part and whole that encourages a recovery of the fragment's past. But on the other hand, it defies and resists this desired historical recovery by reminding the viewer or reader that this putative more can never be recovered or fully experienced. From the perspective of the fragment, part of the goal is precisely to fail at the task of historical reconstruction, or deliberately to frustrate, derange, and disrupt that task. So in the work before you, which has the title Parate, one principal means of indicating that a part is in need of supplement by a whole comes through the embedding of broken syntactical fragments, but these fragments are rarely adequate to the task they solicit. A Bradford canvas takes on its history in the form of the fragments it has embedded, encrusted, and folded within its surface, and that surface, by ensuring one's failure to get either outside of and beneath it, forecloses the possibility of its being conceptualized as a surface that hides a depth that's accessible to thought. Can you read what that says? If anyone's willing to say it. We can't focus it? We can't, Jim? She got it? Wow. Close. Okay. I think that, back a little bit, back. Okay. Yes, okay. Now the work is in focus. Thank you. So in the work before you, which has the title Paris is Burning, the artist appears to have taken a series of cardboard advertisements for super dry jeans, lined them up historically, and attacked them with a belt sander to reveal the stenciled phrase, "fuck straight people," underneath. The ghostly traces of the original advertisements suggest a palimpsest, by which I mean, like, you can sort of see, right, they're lined up, but you could see after he's sanded them away that, like, there's sort of layers of writing from the original ad that sort of persists as a kind of scripto inferior or underwriting. The ghostly traces of the original advertisements suggest a palimpsest, but in something of a visual paradox, the stenciled letters appear to be both on the same surface as the sheets of super dry ad copy and to be the negative space created where a different type of print copy has been allowed to come through an overlying surface. There's a layer of found paper sandwiched between the layer that is closest to the viewer and the one which everything else hangs on. And this inner layer provides the negative relief that the eye requires in order for the stenciled message to appear legible. Fuck straight people. But whatever writing that paper may have had imprinted on its surface, as language, it is now inaccessible. It is now obscured and indecipherable, forever lost to us, inaccessible to thought. So like there's a sort of layer of writing that's sort of sandwiched between the two layers that sort of gives what's necessary to sort of read, let's say, the message of the piece, but that the writing on that layer is sort of inaccessible to us. On the observation, then, that Bradford's surfaces consist less of multiple layers of writing than of multiple layers of paper itself, I wonder what difference it would make to see these surfaces not as palimpsests, but as structured according to a logic of immurement. That is, what if we saw the surfaces themselves as part of a process of building a history of archiving fragments from our everyday world and then walling them up, sealing them off, imprisoning and entombing them within layers of paper. How do the ethics or politics of the surface shift if, rather than a palimpsest, we thought we were looking at a deliberate act of immurement? In a work such as A Truly Rich Man is One Whose Children Run into His Arms Even When His Hands Are Empty, one begins to see what is not available under the palimpsest metaphor and made newly available by a structure of immurement. As the belt sander clears away the various layers of the painting, we recover not so much an underwriting as an underpainting, or rather not paint per se, but a writing that has been turned into paint through the very act of erasure. What was originally print can often find itself transformed into paint. What was once a language can find itself drained of semantic content, and in this manner, in this movement back through the surface, one isn't so much recovering a history or reconstructing a writing and its established set of syntactical relations as one would in a palimpsest. Rather, one is bringing out new relations through erasure and obliteration, new relations signaled in the image's resemblance to a map that corresponds to no territory and is thus inert as navigation. So the detail I just showed you, wow, these pieces kind of go in and out of focus every time I turn around. You can barely tell that this is made up of fragments of paper that have writing all over them. But with the detail, you can a little bit start to see, right, that there's sort of sheets of paper here that have the comic book paper that have sort of text all over text on them, but that upon sanding, sometimes that writing starts to kind of just take on its quality. It's reduced merely to the quality of having color and no sort of semiotic content. As an immurement, the work seems to be actively working against its own unlocking and demystification. The question is, why would it want us to think in this way? Once sandpapered, the surface will on occasion reveal orphan bits of paper or orphan bits of writing, words that appear to have been part of some proposition or narrative. However, as we look, teased by the representational illusion of the bits of glossy magazine, and try to hold the object each of them carries as its past before it was torn up, and as we try to surround it with a protected narrative that gives it meaning, we fail. Broken syntax, phonemes, solitary syllables, there's every hint that these fragments may find completion in what exists just beneath the surface. But everything that suggests the possibility of more depth is cut off from you, and as soon as you attempt to supplement for missing depth by attempting to link the fragments to a missing context, you have left the work and therefore failed. Failed in the sense that it is quite impossible to hold the object on a scale larger than the object itself without that entailing a venture at reading far past the edges of the fragment, and thus past the limits of the work. The question is, why would the work want us to fail? Now that I have described how these surfaces do their work, how they are their own form of critical understanding, I want to close by speculating as to why these works want us to think the way that they do, and to respond to some of the claims of what surface reading is and does. In John Kusic's critique of surface reading, the presentness and aesthetic immersion it affirms, quote, drives a theoretical wedge between reading practices and historicism, close quote. Kusic construes surface reading as a polemic against historicism by equating historicism with ideology critique and taking critique to express, as he puts it, the political orientation that has always been intrinsic to historicism. But limited to his own terms, Kusic stumbles headlong into the aporia that trips up most materialist criticism. How to attend to the material object behind the ideological veils, the cultural readings and meanings, whilst still attending to the object's history. The problem arises precisely because ideology and history have been taken as synonymous, such that the only way to attend to the object is by way of its ideological meanings. In surface reading, we were quite aware of this aporia and thus took surface to mean everything from the literal surface of text, paper, binding, typography, to what is evident, perceptible, apprehensible in text, hence our definition. Look at it rather than through it. But as Walter Ben Michaels has argued in a recent MLA talk, we end up making a strong claim, a strong forceful claim that is correct, but only in a limited way. The claim, in short, that literary critics must resume a practice of attending to the surface of things through a practice of description, but one that stops short of delving deeper in the pursuit of meaning. The stopping short of meaning part is where he believes we go wrong. We may wish, as surface readers, to, in the words of Simon Critchley, let matter matter, and imagine a form of art that isn't motivated by meaning, but that actually isn't possible with an artwork. With anything that is framed and not a part of the infinity that is the natural world, one has to grapple with its meaning. Ligon provides a way of bringing together the language of matter and meaning. Bradford, an opportunity to reimagine the relation or non-relation between aesthetic immersion and politics. First, Ligon. If the surface is an edge where matter and meaning meet, a Ligon canvas helps us to see that a literary surface doesn't exist as a literal thing, say a page, or even metaphorically as a palimpsestic blank parchment, but as an act, a doing. What Ligon helps us to see is that the literary surface exists as a fold in the artist's imagination, or that point where the legibility of the text comes up short, where ink turns into paint, reading into looking, writing into matter. The canvas helps us to see that point where the literary, and here I would quote Foucault, finds a way of limiting its domain so that another structure of meaning can emerge. A Ligon surface wants us to think like it because it's a register where the language of matter and meaning together makes sense. Finally, Bradford. Call me paranoid, but when I hear talk of the theoretical wedge that surface reading drives between reading practices and historicism, I can't help but hear it as another way of saying that it is just reading, flatly so, rather than in the figurative way that Sharon originally offered the phrase. That is, it is just reading with no politics. No politics in the sense of politics as Kusic would have it, of deep reading, Foucauldian paranoia, epistemologies of the closet, depth psychology. This politics, as the recovery of hidden and repressed meanings, is pretty close to what Nietzsche in the genealogy refers to as bringing something home. Perceiving Bradford's canvases as structures of immurement rather than palimpsests, I have a hard time seeing how they are even trying to get us to have a politics, at least in the sense of politics as deep reading. What it does appear that they want us to do is to structure an ethics, to rethink the way we relate to the written world, to the world of signification and meaning. A Bradford canvas instigates and directs the inquiry into what it is saying by holding in reserve the power to defy, resist, and derange the very process of discovery it engenders. These are its conditions of aesthetic immersion, and what it instructs is that there can be no encounter with history without such immersion. But even if we were able to resist the work's power to derange, even if we were able to restore all the fragments to their myriad historical contexts in a way that told a narrative not merely of the origin of the work of art, but of the social world of the artist, the ineluctable demand of its surface would still seem to be, why should all that matter? Thanks.
why can't we just read without the qualifier? To qualify my response, it seems to me in hindsight that a new critical reading and Demani close reading are the same thing. You either resolve the irony or you don't resolve the irony. And in the current state of the humanities, I don't understand why we need to debate what is reading and what is not reading instead of just reading. And reading as a definition, I wrote down the interplay of figure, trope, narrative, rhetoric, and all the contexts that emerge. Just do it.
I can get behind the "just do it" version, I guess. I think one of the, just not to set aside the sort of surface reading like project for a minute. Do you think that definition that you just read of what reading, drop the qualifier, is that does that go for literary language or is that for everything? Because I think one of the, this would be sort of, obviously this question is raised by me trying to like look at examples of reading like behavior, and trope and figure are not necessarily there, right? So, but there's a scale of sort of like very literary to less literary language. So, and a lot of the new like cognitive work on reading really tries to cut across those distinctions between literary and non-literary language. So, that would be one way to kind of get at the problem, which is to say that the Yeah, well, this is actually, there is a kind of like a defense of the humanities, which is maybe kind of behind my comments here, which I could spell out a little bit more clearly, which is actually, I think I actually agree with you, which is to say that I think I would like to, what's happening now, I think, is that the English departments themselves are really under threat, and the way I've seen people responding to that is kind of by like digging deeper into the discipline and saying, let's go back to new formalism or like the ethics of humanism. We have the greatest claim over that. We're the best writers. We feel the most deeply, right? That's sort of one response. I think that's doom. That lies that way.
Right.
And then the other response is sort of like, let's get with the scientists, right? Like, let's become more rigorous. And that, that's kind of cyclically comes back in English. And what I'm actually arguing is that, yes, we generalize this description of reading and try to find actually examples of reading in disciplines that are closer to English than, say, econ or bio, like say in the sort of humanistic social sciences, and to say, actually, rather than sort of like isolating ourselves as like really Englishy or jumping ship and trying to join the scientists, this is the way I've been thinking about it, sort of like we can talk about a kind of federation of weaker disciplines, right? We sort of join together all of those who would be willing to even entertain a project like natural history of an interview, right? To actually, I think we actually have more in common, and that, our kind of, this would be to reiterate the point of my paper, but that our kinds of disciplinary biases and sort of knee-jerk anti-empiricism is keeping us from seeing the kind of commonalities that we have about reading, drop the qualifier, right? So I think I agree with you. I'm okay, it doesn't matter.
Hi, so thank you for 3 really great presentations. I actually had a question for the voiceless here, so for Sharon. I was wondering if you could perhaps say more. All right. I understand, not subaltern then. Could you perhaps say more about this difference or space between a full or complete description and a copy or a perfect copy, and how that gets into ideas of, a faulty copy or an interpretive copy, even a good copy or a bad copy? And for me, I immediately went to the idea of the medieval manuscript, for which every copy is always already glossed and carries within it its own interpretation. I was wondering if you had perhaps looked to these kinds of older texts or codices for any sort of inspiration with the idea of surface reading.
Bravo.
Hi, I thank you guys. My question is about the relationship within the Federation of Weak Disciplines. Okay. Heather, so it drifts mostly towards you, but I'd actually be interested to see if it's resonant for Sharon or Stephen too. It has to do with it's almost irresistible to me because I'm sort of have always been interested in anthropology, to follow you from Geertz to the natural history of an interview as a story of repatriation from the scene of the Balinese cockfight to that woman in her kitchen, 1956. Feels like a story about anthropology and sociology that I kind of think I know, but I think I'd be interested to hear you guys reflect on it a little bit. And Stephen, the reason I think it might be resonant for you, I'm not sure, is that the scale shift in the Bradford conclusion of your talk, or the shift from politics to ethics, I guess could be understood as not just a different register, but a different scale of analysis. That is, ethics being slightly more humble at one level than politics, less systematic, less total. And Sharon, since the Bart of 1970 is kind of coming out of a kind of structuralist, anthropological, Levi-Straussian moment, it might be relevant to you too. So the question is this: does that, but mostly for you, Heather, but does that shift from anthropology to sociology resonate with you and you three, as a kind of historicization of disciplinary jockeying or proximity to literary studies and its norms and its blind spots? And if so, does that also sort of open out for you guys in your conversations that are happening now to some kind of post-anthropological treatment of the other? I'm citing the Rabinow moment, some kind of after the collapse of anthropology as cultural critique moment that we're in, or some kind of way in which the humanities become more immanent to their object culture as opposed to occupying the space of the supposed authoritative space of the outside interpreter of the culture. And those are ways of trying kind of clumsily to grope at the question I'm trying to ask you guys, but maybe you can just reflect on post-anthropological, and the humble corollary would be, if there's a sort of collapsed distance argument implied here in the shift from anthropology to sociology, that is, sociologists are usually from the culture they're interpreting, is that collapsed distance working out in your current conversations as a way of figuring out that some texts are better for descriptive reading as opposed to hermeneutic reading because of their distance or closeness to the interpreter, either across space or time, sort of to pick up on the medieval, early modern, or cultural, transcultural, across translation problem. Looking at a page of French makes me think about that too. So, sorry, that's a little bit rambling, but maybe you can find a core in that question somewhere.
Repeat, though, what you said. There was a moment where you said that the shift from, or the after anthropology moment could also sort of reflect a turn in which disciplines become more attentive to their proper objects? Like, or
immersive, I think.
Oh.
Like,
what did I say, Heather?
I took it as more like closer to your object.
Yes, closer to your object.
Closer to your object.
And the part about what I was suggesting to you, Stephen, was just that ethics and politics, as you were reading them through Bradford, seemed to imply to me, and against Kusic's charges in a way, seemed to imply to me that you're shrugging off the supposed burden that Kusic is trying to lay on you guys, which is like that you're somehow not political or post-political, and to think about it in more scalar terms, so that, again, it would be easier for an anthropologist to say this is the politics of the Balinese cockfight. And I take it the empirical traditions, empirical but not positivist, of the kind of sociology that Heather's invoking, would maybe talk less totalistically or less systematically about ethical and, in fact, behavioral and gestural occurrences around that same interpretive object. So I guess I'm trying to sync up different kinds of ways in which anthropological and implied humanities totalizing criticism is being shouldered aside by your project, and trying to explore whether that also implies a kind of immanence of the critic to the society producing the objects under analysis.
Yeah. I mean, I'll just get started. I think these guys probably have stuff to say too. I mean, I would like to talk to you more actually about the kind of historicization of the disciplines there, because I think actually part of what it's not sort of accidental that there's an anthropologist and a sociologist or a kind of sociological project in the paper, because I'm really interested in this microanalytic tradition, and it's a kind of a mix of everyone, right? And if you think about the Chicago School of Sociology and the kind of mixing between sociology and anthropology that went on there, I'm kind of interested. I'm basically interested in questions of scale and how these kind of like extremely small scale kinds of analyses of situations actually were able to cross some of these kind of boundaries, right? And that, actually, like Mead and Bateson's use of photography, like in the 40s, and how that links up with this work in the 60s, right? And so actually it's kind of like, it's actually around the thinking of scale that some of this kind of account of like disciplinary succession or something is messed up, right? That there's actually there's this sort of microanalytic tradition that keeps coming back in a way. Mm-hmm. 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 Yeah, and then I would just add that one of the things we've talked a lot about is sort of the obvious and the evident, and somebody I'm really interested in, Irving Goffman, was sort of like, it's interesting the sort of political readings of his work, because he turned his eye on like middle class American like behavior, and so for some people it was like the complete kind of loss of any kind of critical distance and the complete naturalization of those norms. I think you can argue exactly the opposite, that it was like an utter denaturalization of that. So anyway, and I think one of the things that since we've been sort of talking about surface reading, people often ask like, it seems to be geared towards sort of like realist fiction, right? That seems to be and we are it is like a 19th century like fictional textual object that we are trying to read, Benito Cereno. So people often ask us about poetry for one thing, but also work from a more distant period. So I think, this question of the obvious and the evident and the sort of critical stance toward culture, I'm not really answering your question, I'm just sort of rephrasing your question to say that, like, what kind of literary object is really, really important around that question, I guess.
Yeah, I guess for me, in place of the phrase becoming more modest, I think I would say that part of what motivates me is this real desire to sort of submit to the artwork, in the sense that, and this is partly inspired by like, Bersani kind of talking about, the relation to the artwork as instructive about relationality as such, and not distinguishing between like relations between persons or relations between things. And so I guess for me that's, I'm trying to make a turn, like that turn away from the idea that the work is a prism into like politics, or an expression of the desire on the part of the artist for what they want to put into the world and what they want to take out of the world, but a setting up of a relation, a first relation between viewer and object that can be instructive about relationality as such. I don't know if that.
Yeah, and I think Sharon wants to respond too. Jim, you are so very fancy. Did you get that?
Yeah.
Yeah. Don James? Yeah.
I was struck in your talk, Stephen, at how often you talked about what the text wants, and then in your last comment about submitting to what the text wants. And that seems very much related to the shift you were talking about from politics to ethics. So there's something about responding to that desire of the text that is sort of an ethical decision. But talking about what a text wants and desires is interesting because it seems to return us to a kind of unconscious that a text would seem to have. And so I wonder if something interesting is happening with desire when we talk about it in the context of surface reading. Does desire turn into something like very unfamiliar? And are your projects in some way ways of redefining what desire is, where it is, what its dimensionality looks like, things like that?
I mean, okay, I have two responses. One is the question, does speaking of what a text wants return us to the idea of the textual unconscious, because we assume that desire only takes place through the mechanisms of the unconscious? Or, like, I use that language because I want to sort of say that my movement through the work is structured by the work itself. That's it. That there's a structure, there's an architecture that I feel as if I'm being asked to move through, and I can only say that it is the work that wants me to, I don't know, like that.
Yeah.
That like that. I don't want to say it's or return it to the artist. It's just there's a structure, and I'm being asked to work my way through it, and so I use the language of want. I mean, it's interesting because, of course, I'm using the language of want, or sitting at my computer, I'm thinking, oh, this is going to like trigger all kinds of responses of the sort that you just made. But
I mean, so then want would have a lot to do with structure, I guess is.
Yeah. I mean, I actually this has led me in a direction that, sort of where this project this project doesn't sound all that ethical, but it actually does have that kind of component for me. And one of the examples that I'm really interested in is how these kind of microanalytic techniques were applied to think about like social outsiders of different varieties. And so I'm really interested in the kind of ecological view of public sex that emerges in Laud Humphrey's 1971 book Tea Room Trade, and that there is a kind of ethics of actually not, like, the problem with desire would be that, basically in the case of like, people, men who have sex with men or whatever, it's like psychoanalysts are like the doctors of your desire, they know all about it. And, Laud Humphreys basically gives us a kind of ecological view of what's happening in tea rooms, let's say in, bathrooms where, men are having sexual encounters with each other. And it's really, it's largely about these WPA restrooms that were built in public parks in the 30s. It's like, these parks, these restrooms have to have no stall doors. They have to have a window by the door. They have to be isolated enough from traffic. There's certain kind of conditions that obtain, and then desire can be there, right? But it's really not, and Humphreys actually draws these diagrams with sort of X's and O's representing, the men as they make their way around this space, right? So it really is a situation where the actual social space and the architecture produces desire, and actually when people are interviewed about their experiences, right? It's like the desire that they express is for that place, right? So, I'm really interested, and in fact, one could argue that it was because Humphreys took this ecological view of these same-sex relations that public sex, this highly stigmatized activity becomes kind of like a social game like any other, right? So I think that actually, yes, I do want to spatialize desire in just the way that you're suggesting, and I think that the sort of, that for me, this kind of behaviorist blankness around interiority actually can produce really important kinds of effects. Oh, wait, hold on, Jim. I think we cannot silence.